Georgia Bonesteel, the First Lady of Lap Quilting. A devoted wife, mother, and an avid quilter for 16 years. Georgia has written 3 bestsellers and starred in 4 television series about lap quilting. As a teacher, she spends much of her time traveling across the country and the world, sharing her techniques, her methods, and her designs with quilting guilds and groups. Today, Georgia brings all of her knowledge, experiences, and shortcuts, as well as 3 new quilt designs, home to you.
Hi, I'm Georgia Bonesteel. Thank you for inviting me into your home. If you've ever wanted to make a quilt, but the thought of an endless expanse of fabric and maybe even a cumbersome quilting frame has prevented you, I'm here to tell you it doesn't have to be that way. I've devoted a good deal of my life to quilting, and I've always concentrated on ways to make the steps quicker, easier, and more manageable for everyone. I call my approach lap quilting. It's so simple. Instead of piecing an entire top and then quilting it, with my lap quilting technique, you piece and quilt in small block-size units. Then you join the completed blocks together. It's fun watching the quilt grow as you complete each step to form this full-size quilt. I'm looking forward to sharing this technique with you. I know you'll enjoy lap quilting as much as I have. Together, we'll savor the success of each of our seams, and we might even learn from our mistakes. So let's get started. During the next 60 minutes, you're going to learn a lot about how to make a quilt. But first, I thought I would take a moment to talk about quilts in general. All quilts have 3 layers: a decorative top, the fluffy, warm filling, and a backing. All layers are stitched or quilted together. Now basically there are 3 types of quilts: whole cloth, applique, and pieced, which is a type of quilt we'll be concentrating on today. In this pieced quilt top, a single block design is repeated to create an overall design. The basic block I've designed for our 3 quilts is called Going My Way. You'll see why I've chosen to call it that. Okay, in drafting this block, I started with a 12-inch square. I marked the 6-inch midpoint on each side and connected them diagonally. Then the inside square was divided into 9 equal parts, each corner divided into equal triangles, and the center square divided into 4 more triangles. All of these lines will become seams dividing the different colors of fabric. See how these triangles create arrows pointed outward, or arrows going my way. When I finish the basic drafting, I always mark my grain lines. This helps me to make sure that the edges, the outside of the block, are on the straight of the grain and not the bias. This simple Going My Way block can be used to make 3 entirely different looking quilts. This bright, festive carnival quilt is what we'll be making together, step by step. Each Going My Way block is a 12-inch square, and the squares are put together in a simple block-to-block setting. The black and white accents create a lively contrast to the vivid colors. The other 2 quilts, Garden Party and True Blue, are variations of the Going My Way block used for the carnival quilt. Now, if you take the Going My Way block design but stitch it up in an array of navy calicos with a touch of muslin, you'll be making an entirely different looking quilt, which I've named True Blue. Besides the fabric colors, the difference between the carnival quilt and True Blue is that the 4 corner squares and the center square are solid rather than dividing it into triangles. This makes the block much easier to piece than the block for the carnival quilt. There are also mitered borders sewn all the way around the 12-inch block on the True Blue quilt. Notice that when the blocks are joined together, the borders form an elongated star. And if you studied the top for a moment, you might even see some spools. Now, if you prefer making a smaller, more feminine wall hanging, you will just love Garden Party. This is made from the exact same block design going my way, except I reduced the block size to an 8-inch square. Notice how I turned the corner triangles and left the center square rather than dividing it up into triangles. And when you look at it from a distance, you can see how the colors are placed to create 4 bands: yellow, rose, aqua, and lavender. Now, although this video deals specifically with the making of the carnival quilt, these instructions include the basic principles of all patchwork and will apply to most patterns, including True Blue or Garden Party. For more specifics about these 2 quilts, refer to the worksheet and the extra instructions I've included at the end of this video. Outlined in the table of contents are all the topics you'll cover as you learn to lap quilt. Before you begin, you'll want to take a look at the supply list and gather the basic items you'll need. Now, if you're not familiar with quilting terms, this might be a good time to pause your VCR and familiarize yourself with them. They will help you understand what I'm talking about when I use my quilting lingo. For instance, when I refer to dog ears, I'm not talking about your pet's ears. Your worksheet also gives you diagrams showing each quilt's assembly and information on how they differ, their finished sizes, the perimeter, number and size of blocks, and the fabric requirements. If you're planning to make a quilt for a king, queen, or twin bed, this information will help you measure your bed and figure out how many blocks you'll need. Now, take a look at the patterns on the back of the worksheet. These patterns are actually full-size patterns, and I know that those of you who are used to making your own patterns will agree it's really nice to have this done for you. Creating precise patterns takes a steady hand and precision drawing. The pieces labeled A12, B12, C12, and D12 are used for the 12-inch block, and the pieces labeled A8, B8, C8, and D8 are used for the smaller 8-inch block found in the Garden Party wall hanging. The additional pieces you see are used for the borders of the quilt and are also labeled according to the block size. So, we'll get started by making templates for the 12-inch square using patterns on your worksheet. Okay, let's get started with vinyl templates. I like these best for several reasons. You can see through them, but they don't get lost on the fabric, and they're long-lasting. To transfer the patterns to vinyl, place the printed patterns on your worksheet. You'll notice that I'm using the pattern for the 12-inch square block, but you make the templates for the 8-inch square in exactly the same manner. Now, using a ruler as a straight edge, carefully trace triangle A12. Be exact, these pattern lines already include the 1/4-inch seam allowance. When you're finished tracing triangle A12, just continue tracing all the remaining pieces. Be sure to also mark the grain line and the corner dots. Then label them exactly the way they appear on your worksheet. Now cut out the patterns using your paper scissors. Also, use a small hole punch to open up the 1/4-inch turns. If you transfer these marks to the back of your fabric, you'll have a sewing guide. But if you don't have any frosted vinyl on hand, you can make templates with poster board, the way they appear on your worksheet. If you're working right along with me, don't be afraid to use the pause button on your VCR to slow me down. After all, I didn't make this quilt in an hour. You know the choices of fabrics are endless, and you're on your own in that decision. But from experience, I can tell you a couple of things to keep in mind. You'll spend weeks, well maybe months working on this project, so choose colors that you like and pick ones that wear well and fit into your decorating scheme. This is such a personal decision. And it's not a bad idea to photocopy and enlarge the schematic from the worksheet. Use colored pencils to color it in for different placement of colors. As you can see by looking at my color schematic, I could have put the carnival quilt together in an entirely different way for a totally different look. Then when you've settled on your color combinations, it's also a good idea to make a sample block, hang it on the wall, and live with it for a while. Looking at our 3 blocks, they really look different because of the choices of fabrics and colors. And when buying fabrics, first select the size quilt you're interested in making and make a note of the fabric requirements for each color. Add an extra yard for binding, and then purchase a half a yard extra of each color for safety's sake. You've purchased your fabrics and pre-washed each fabric to be included in your quilt. This makes the fabric easier to handle and ensures that you can launder your quilt someday. Use a normal cycle and only partially dry it. Fabric irons nicely when it's only partially dry. To speed up the cutting process, double the fabric so you can cut out 2 pieces at once. Now, align the arrow on your template with either the crosswise or straight of the grain on the fabric. It works either way. If the fabric wants to shift around when you're marking, here's a little tip for you. Place a piece of fine sandpaper underneath to stabilize it. For marking the fabric, use a sharp pencil or chalk. Never use a ballpoint pen. The ink has been known to smudge and come through to the front of the quilt. Now, trace triangle A12 32 times on each color of your folded fabric. This will give you 64 triangles, or enough for the 48 blocks and the border too, plus 1 piece left over. Then trace template B12 24 times on the folded fabric. And for cutting out D12, the small center triangles, here's another time-saving tip of mine. Place the right sides of 2 contrasting fabrics together and trace around D12 48 times. Then, when you cut out the triangles, the raw edges of both colors are already aligned and ready to be sewn. Okay, when cutting out your fabric pieces, use nice sharp scissors. The cut edge of each piece is very important because you'll be sewing a 1/4 inch from the edge when you piece the block together. Another way of getting a great edge is to use a rotary cutter and a wide, thick ruler. Place your double piece of fabric or even 4 layers of fabric on the cutting board and align the ruler with the edge of the marked shape. Then, using your little pinky to stabilize the ruler, apply pressure against both the ruler and cutter. There. Now stack your pieces according to shape and color. How are you doing? Okay? Good. Well, you've probably noticed that we haven't traced or cut out the 2 colors of fabric used in triangle C12 yet. And there's a good reason for that. My quickie piecing technique. The old-fashioned way to piece these 2 triangles together would be to cut out 192 of one color and 192 of the second color, and then sew them together. But whenever you have 2 right triangles joined together to form a square, you can use my quickie piecing technique. Here's how it works. Place the right sides of each of the 2 contrasting colors together. In the Carnival quilt, I've chosen to use black and white fabric for my corner squares. Then trace around triangle C12 192 times, flipping the triangle so that the edges are butted together. Now, in this step, you can either use your 1/4 inch presser foot as a stitching guide and proceed directly to your machine, or you can go back and with your ruler, mark a broken line, which becomes your stitching line, a 1/4 inch from each side of the diagonal lines. And then on your sewing machine, stitch along the broken or stitching lines. Once you've sewn all of the diagonal edges, cut along the solid lines, unfold, and you'll have 192 black and white squares. Isn't that a great time-saving technique? And now, to check the accuracy of these black and white squares, use your square B as a master template. A master template is one that is equal in size, including your seam allowances, to your assembled piecework. Then trim off any excess fabric and dog ears. This quickie piecing technique is a great time saver, one that I use and highly recommend. So always double check your patterns or quilt designs to see how many times you can use it. Now, we're about to start piecing the block together. So if you want to catch up, this is a good time to stop the tape and finish transferring and cutting your pieces. Go get a cup of coffee. With all our pieces cut and stacked, we're ready to put our blocks together. But before we start stitching, I'd like to say a word about sewing a straight, true 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's very important to be accurate because if your seams are too skinny, your patchwork block will be too large. And if your seams are too fat, your block will be too small. The seam allowance sewn in the fabric must match the amount that is allowed on the template. To check this, place the template underneath the presser foot. Slowly lower the needle, then make a mental and visual note of where the edge of your template aligns. This is where the edge of your fabric will align as it passes under the needle. In addition to watching the presser foot, some people place masking tape on the throat plate or even use a magnetic marker to ensure an accurate 1/4 inch seam. Or as on my Bernina, you can move your needle position. The important thing is that the seams are straight and accurate, so choose a method that works best for you. Now another thing I want to point out is the closed seams. All seams should be pressed closed, not open. Closed seams are much stronger. It's a real challenge to get the stitching just right, but when you do, it looks great and everything fits together perfectly. To help you keep an eye on your block sizes, keep your master templates, your sample block, and your colored schematic close by for easy reference. The center square of the carnival quilt we are making is pieced with triangles of 4 different colors. We'll start by sewing our small pink and blue triangles together 48 times. Place them right sides together. Well, they're already that way. Remember, we cut them that way, with the pink triangle on top and the right angle at the top right. As you sew them together, it looks like you're making a kite tail. Now sew the peach and aqua triangles together with the peach on top and the right angle again right here at the top. Now check the stitching by using C12 as the master template and trim away any excess fabric. Now, with the seam staggered, sew the pink and blue triangles to the peach and aqua triangles. Now, see where all of the seams come together in the center here? That's where you need to distribute the weight of the seams. To do this, I'll show you a little trick. Take a pin or even your seam ripper and free the stitches in the seam allowance of the first set of seams. Then rotate the seams in the same direction. And press flat. We'll check the accuracy of the stitching again by using square B as a master template this time. And now's your chance to trim off those dog ears and any excess fabric. There. Now let's clean up the back of our work as well. You want to remember to always check the directions of the seams. Be certain that the seam allowances are even so the contrasting color doesn't eke out. That would come back to haunt you when you quilt, and then it's too late to trim because it's locked inside. Once the center squares are complete, it's time to begin to piece the 9 patch of the center in Going My Way. It's best to arrange all of our pieces in sequence so we can eliminate a lot of starting and stopping. We'll begin assembling by piecing together 3 rectangles. Then we'll sew these rectangles together to form the 9 patch. Starting at the top, sew 1 black and white square to 1 blue square 48 times. Then add another black and white square to form a rectangle. Do the same thing with the aqua and black-white squares. Then sew the center rectangle together by attaching a pink and then a peach square to the center piece square. Now arrange the rectangles according to your sample block and pin them together, staggering the seams. Then sew the 3 rectangles, peeking at the seams as we sew. I call this pin and peek. This is a good habit to form. It can prevent having to rip out mistakes later. And then for the next step, clip the seam allowance and twirl the seams as we did before. so we can eliminate the bulky intersections here too. Now that the center 9 patch is complete, you can add the arrows. To do this, align the right angle of the one A12 triangle to the center of the block. This leaves those little dog ears hanging off the block. Sew the A12 triangle to the opposite side. Then sew the 2 remaining triangles to complete the block. Do this 48 times. All through? Good. Now here is the key to making your quilt fit together. Check that all 48 blocks are exactly 12.5 inches square. At this time, I mark the back of my blocks to find that perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. Perfect. Well, almost. Now, let's set these aside as we get our border pieces ready. For the next step, making your border pieces and outside corners, I'm going to show you yet another shortcut. On your black and white fabric, measure and cut 2.5 inch wide strips, as I've done with these. You will need 14 black strips and 7 white strips, each 36 inches long. These can be cut on the straight of the grain or the crosswise grain. Working with 3 of these, 2 black and 1 white, we're off to the sewing machine. Sew 1 black, 1 white, and 1 black together. You'll need 7 of these. Like that. Now, press the seams toward the dark fabric. Okay, with that done, lay the fabric flat on your table. Then trace around template E12 8 times. And cut out the 8 triangles for the corners of the border. For the side borders, trace and cut 28 triangles using template F12. With the E12 corner triangles cut, sew 4 pairs together to form the corner units. Then stitch these 4 black and white corners to 4 different colored A12 triangles. Sewing along the long side of the triangles. Now you have your 4 corner squares. Set these aside for later and take out the colored quilt schematic. You'll want to refer to this while preparing the border strips to make sure the solid A12 triangles are sewn to the correct side of the striped triangles. To prepare the top borders, lay a striped triangle, right angle pointing up, and sew an aqua A12 triangle to the right side of it. Do this to 6 of the striped triangles. Then, sew a peach A12 triangle to the opposite sides of each of the 6 striped triangles. Now, with those triangles joined together, you'll have 6 rectangles which, when stitched together in pairs, make the 3 top border sections. To make the bottom border, do the exact same thing, except join blue A12 triangles to the right side of the 6-piece black and white triangles, and pink A12 triangles to the left side. Then join these 6 rectangles to make 3 pairs. With the top and bottom border units complete, Make the left side border by sewing a peach A12 triangle to the right edge of 8-pieced black and white triangles, and a blue triangle to the left side. Then take these 8 rectangles and sew pairs together to form 4 units. How are you doing? It's easy, isn't it? Now, following the same simple method but with different colors, make the right side border by sewing a pink A12 triangle to the right edge of 8 striped triangles, an aqua A12 triangle to the left edge, and then sewing the 8 rectangles together to form 4 units. There! Now that you know how, just follow your schematic and finish all of the border units. To make the lap quilting process easier, I've joined the 12.5-inch squares in units of 4, and that will come, of course, to our 24.5-inch blocks. Notice that in each block, our color placement is the same. I've directed the seams the same way each time. I've also snipped and twirled the center connection. All the blocks will automatically stagger when the final seams are sewn. With the blocks joined together and given that twirl, I can then stack all the 12-piece blocks. Now, by referring to your colored quilt schematic, you can see where to attach the border units to the outside or the perimeter blocks. As you can see, the 2 center 24.5-inch blocks don't need a border at all. Starting with the one corner on the schematic, sew the peach corner square to the left side of one of the aqua peach borders. With a left corner unit sewn, we can then go to our remaining borders. Sew an aqua corner to an aqua peach border on the right side, and then to the right side, sew a pink corner unit to a border section, and our last one is the blue, which will be sewn on the left side to a border unit. As soon as these are all sewn, then all of our borders are ready to be attached to our perimeter blocks. To help you see the location and arrangements of the colors, you'll be seeing an enlargement of the quilt schematic. For the right side border, sew 4 pink aqua border units to the right sides of each of the 4 blocks. For the left side borders, sew 4 blue peach border units to the left sides of each of the 4 blocks. Now that the side borders are complete, you can attach the top border by sewing 1 aqua peach unit to the top edge of 1 block, and then sew the peach corner unit to the top of 1 blue peach bordered square. Sew the aqua corner unit to the top of 1 pink aqua border unit. For the bottom border, sew 1 pink blue border unit to the bottom of 1 square. Sew the pink corner unit to the bottom of 1 pink aqua bordered square. Then sew the blue corner unit to the bottom of 1 blue peach bordered square. Now, on to the real fun, quilting. The beauty of any quilt emerges when you begin quilting and see the shadows created by the stitches on the surface and the back. But how do you decide where to quilt? How much of the area do you fill in? Should you use curved or straight lines? White or colored thread? Decisions, decisions. What's a quilter to do? We'll be taking a look at all those questions in a moment, but first, start with the most important thing you'll need to know in lap quilting. You must leave a 1/2 inch free on all 4 edges of the block or section that will be connected to other blocks. Here's an example. The edge of this section of the carnival quilt is going to be joined to another section, so part of that 1/2 inch will be needed for the seam. Keep this in mind as we take a look at some of those creative choices I just proposed. How much quilting you do is certainly a matter of personal preference. This wasn't true years ago because it was necessary to keep quilting stitches close together to keep the batting from separating and becoming lumpy. Today, with our polyester batting, this isn't a problem. But for aesthetic reasons, I personally still don't like to leave an area as large as 2 to 3 inches unquilted. And speaking of personal preference, the kind of quilting you do can vary a great deal. The most traditional type of quilting is outline quilting, which really emphasizes the pattern. This is usually done 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch from the piece seam. Now, the compatible lines of outline quilting differ from the contrary quilting lines that cross the piece seam, such as the fleur-de-lis I used for the carnival quilt. Although the choices of quilting designs do vary, the purpose is always the same. Your stitches should enhance the quilt pattern. So evaluate your block and decide whether you want straight or curvy lines, or if there are specific points you want to emphasize. And remember that the amount of quilting in each section should be consistent, since the blocks are going to be sewn together. Also, be aware that quilting will result in some take-up. For approximately every 20 inches of quilting, the section will shrink about 1/2 an inch. With your decisions made, it's time to prepare your blocks for quilting. To do this, check that your blocks are squared off and that strings and threads are all clipped. One of my teaching friends calls this pruning your blocks. When that's all done, it's time to mark the stencil lines. This is easier if you do it before the 3 layers, the backing, batting, and top are put together. Now there are a variety of tools you can use to transfer your quilting lines. Fabric markers, a number 2 pencil, if you mark very lightly with it, soap slivers, soapstone, chalk markers, or a silver pencil and masking tape. The important thing here is that whatever tool you choose, be sure and test it on your material and see if the marks remove easily. The fleur-de-lis motif used on the carnival quilt was designed to enhance the corner triangles on each block. You'll find the full-size stencil printed on your worksheet. To transfer the stencil lines to your block, first, trace the motif on tracing paper. With the stencil traced, I can tape the paper on a sunny window. Then place the block on top and with a pencil or fabric marker, lightly transfer the stencil design onto the cloth. To simplify the design, you might want to eliminate these inside curved lines. An alternative in transferring your quilting designs is to use a pre-cut stencil. Hold it in place on your block, then mark inside the cutout area. Any straight lines can be marked with masking tape after the layers are connected. Once you've marked your quilting lines, you need to baste the 3 layers together. Use the piece sections as patterns and cut the batting and backing the same size. It isn't necessary to cut the backing larger, but if a little bit of it ekes out, it's all right because it will be trimmed evenly after it's all quilted. Align the corners of all 3 pieces and then pin in place. To baste the layers together, start in the center and take long stitches toward the outside. Use a contrasting thread, but don't use black because sometimes it leaves a mark when it's removed. Basting is a very important step as it stabilizes all the layers and temporarily holds them in place. Some people use safety pins rather than basting stitches, and that's okay, but never use straight pins to hold your layers together. Invariably, they will come loose and probably end up in your husband's toes. With basting completed, we're ready to begin quilting. You can lap quilt anywhere, but if you're at home, pick a comfortable place with good light. Now the needle used should be a short quilting needle. I use a number 12, but if this seems too tiny, start with a number 8 and work up to a smaller one. The quilting thread can be all cotton or a blend. The color is optional, but white or ecru is used more often than colored thread. If you're new at quilting, consider using a light thread on a light fabric and a dark thread on a darker fabric. If you use a contrasting thread, your stitches may show up a little more than you want them to. Now, cut off an 18 to 24-inch length of thread and place a foolproof knot at the end. To make this knot, and now watch carefully, take the unknotted end and place it towards the needle. Holding that secure in place, wrap it 1, 2, 3 times around, sliding that down in between, and then carefully pulling that knot all the way through. And there's your knot, and with the tail, I always come and snip that off. The best thing about this is you can always depend on the size of the knot, and no more sticky finger knots. Before we start quilting, I must tell you that how you hold the needle is a very personal thing. Everyone's hands and even their laps are different, so I can just give you guidelines and you'll have to determine your most comfortable position. I use an indented thimble on the middle finger of my quilting hand. I should, but I don't protect the finger on my off hand. That's the hand that will be underneath. But if this is your first time, you may want to try a leather thimble or a rubber fingertip. You can get these rubber fingertips at an office supply store. Now, to begin quilting, always start in the center of the block. Pull the knotted thread through so that the knot pops in between the fabric layers and is caught in the batting. The offhand is opposite the needle direction. Take 2 to 3 stitches each time you insert the needle. As soon as the point of the needle appears, go down again. Try to keep the length of your stitches consistent, but remember, this is the human element of the quilt process, so a wee bit of offness or unevenness is acceptable. Remember to always start quilting in the center of the block and work towards the edges. Now relax and enjoy the process. And before you realize it, you will have completed one area and it will be time to move on to the next. Now, when moving from one area to another, it's legal to float the needle through the batting rather than ending and starting again. There. And now you just continue. But when you run out of thread, just as I'm about to do here, you'll need to put a knot in your thread. To do this, simply form a loop with the thread, position the point of the needle in the loop, and slide the knot close to the surface of the fabric. Take a short back stitch, keeping the needle caught in the batting. Give it a yank so that the knot pops inside. Bring up the needle about an inch away and clip off any extending threads. Now we're ready to rethread and start again. If you thread several needles at a time, as I often do, you won't have to interrupt your quilting. Now to stabilize the layers as you quilt, you can use a hoop. I prefer to use a supported one, so the offhand or arm does not have to hold the hoop and the material too. That way your arm can relax and you can bring it up close to your body. This method is like quilting in a frame, but you have the advantage of being able to turn your work in the hoop to reach all those odd angles. Whichever quilting position you use, keep in mind that it takes time and patience to be consistent and be pleased with your results. I found that it's best to block out a certain time period each day that is my special quilting time. Then before I know it, my quilt is done, and I've solved all the world's difficult dilemmas at the same time. Once the last stitch is taken, you're ready to assemble the blocks to form rows. But first, clean up and trim the sections. Make sure that the edges of the backing and the batting are even with the front of your quilt. And also, eliminate any stencil marks with a clean, wet sponge or special pencil eraser. And check again the size of your blocks or sections to make sure they're all the same size. Whew, good. Now, using your quilt diagram for reference, lay out the blocks, making certain the border colors are in the correct position. Then, mark each block's position in the quilt with numbered pieces of masking tape. We'll start by connecting the first two blocks. Go ahead and pin the batting and the backing to the back side on one block, and then on the other block, to make this lap quilting connection, just pin the backing to the back side. And this frees the batting and the front of the other quilted block. Then picking up the two right sides of your quilted blocks, pin one corner, and I like to come down all the way to the other end and pin the other corner. If there's any easing, and there might be just a little bit, then you've got two stabilizing pins to then go right in the middle. And notice how that automatically staggers. We did that wonderful twirling, and you have an automatic stagger for that point, and also this outside edge where your border is connected. Match up the right angles, and you're all set to go to the sewing machine. It's worth mentioning that as you start to join your blocks together, the quilt grows and it gets heavy, so you might add some extra space around your sewing machine. Machine stitch the fronts together with a 1/4 inch seam. I like to start at one edge and back stitch. You might also notice that I've added a walking foot to the sewing machine. It allows me to stitch extra layers. Place the joined blocks on a flat surface, not on your lap, and then take all the pins out that were holding the backing and the batting to the back side. Then trim the batting on one side so that it can butt up with the other batting on the opposite side. Just free that. You don't want a poochy intersection. And once that is all removed and your closed seam falls flat and the batting butts up next to each other, then let the same side fall on top of the closed flat seam. Pin this in place, and it's at this point I studied the carnival quilt and decided I wanted an extra row of quilting on the front side, almost in the ditch. I would do the quilting at this time with this back still to the back side, but one flat side on top. Once that had been done, then I could, of course, remove my pins, and the opposite side will turn under a 1/4 inch, and I start in the middle of each section and let this fall in place. Some people like to even baste this first, because then this will fall right on top of that flat lapped seam connection. I would pin about every 1.5 inches. And once that is pinned in place, then you are ready to take your applique stitch, which is a hidden stitch, not a whip stitch. You have to make certain that the stitches do not go through to the front of the quilt and do not catch any seam allowances on the sides where the rows will be connected. You'll sew a 3rd section to the first 2 to form one horizontal row, keeping the sewn connecting seams in the same direction. Then assemble all 12 blocks to form these 4 horizontal rows of 3 sections each. With the blocks joined, you are ready to join the rows. We'll join the horizontal rows using the same procedure we used for the blocks. Notice I've already pinned back the batting and backing on one side, pinned back just the backing on the other, and pinned the fronts of the 2 long rows together. But before we can continue to make the lap quilting connection, we need to just snip the batting that was caught from that block-to-block connection. Also, check to be sure that the colors align on the front of your quilt. Now we're ready to sew. Continue making the lap quilting connection for all 4 horizontal rows in exactly the same manner as you pinned the blocks. Once the rows are all joined, you can baste the raw edges, and then we're ready for that final step, which is the bias binding. I planned the binding for the carnival quilt when I designed the quilt, so I would be sure to have enough white fabric. I'd prefer to use a bias fold for my binding because the double edge is so long-wearing. Both the crosswise and the stray of the grain lie on the edge, thereby making it stronger than a binding with just a single thread. I've pinned the folded bias strip on the front of the quilt with the raw edges aligning the raw edges of the quilt. Now we're ready to begin sewing, but before we do, use a fabric marker on all 4 corners and make a mark a 1/4 inch inside each corner of the quilt. Then, leaving a few inches unstitched at the beginning, attach the binding with a 1/4 inch seam. To miter the quilt corners and form a perfectly squared off corner, sew the bias strip up to the 1/4 inch mark and backstitch. You've probably noticed that I haven't had to use my hand to raise and lower the presser foot. My Bernina has a knee lever to do that for me. Remove the quilt from the machine, align the raw edges, and start sewing again at the 1/4 inch mark. After you've gone all the way around the quilt, sewing the bias strip to the front, you'll come to a point where the bias strip meets itself. Stop stitching a few inches away from the intersection because you'll be completing the connection with a diagonal seam rather than a straight seam. To do this, mark the bottom raw edge on the loose fold where it first meets the other bottom edge. Then mark the top fold where it meets the other top fold. Unfold the bias and draw a line connecting the 2 points. Then draw another line 1/2 inch from this diagonal line and cut away the excess. Now, join the strips with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and connect this loose section to the front of the quilt with your 1/4 inch seam. Fold the bias around the back of the quilt and slip stitch this in place. Now I'm just putting on that final touch, that all-important signature. It is so important to identify your work for posterity. You can stem stitch or buttonhole stitch your initials anywhere you want to on your quilt, but don't forget the date. And if you want to attach a message or a poem, simply type it on muslin. Go ahead and put the muslin right in the typewriter and then attach it to the back of your quilt. After all, the back is just as pretty as the front. I hope you've enjoyed making the carnival quilt along with me. It has given me great personal pleasure both in making the carnival quilt and in sharing design and piecing techniques with you. But stay tuned, because as promised, I'm going to give you instructions for making the variation quilts. Once you've mastered the techniques of making the carnival quilt, you might want to make the quilt True Blue or the wall-hanging garden party. But before you get started, there are a few things I want to go over with you. The blocks in the blue and white quilt True Blue are all 12-inch squares, just like the blocks in the carnival quilt. But notice how the Going My Way block has been altered. The center square is made up entirely of squares. This really simplifies our piecing, since the only templates needed are B12 for the squares and A12 for the large corner triangles. These blue and white blocks are surrounded by mitered borders. To add a mitered border, each of the blocks must start with a perfect 12.5-inch square. With blocks pieced, we're ready to add the mitered borders. To determine the length of the border strips, add the width of the border 2 times to the length of the block. In this case, I wanted my borders to be 3 inches wide. So I added 3.5 inches, the half inches for the seam allowance, plus 3.5 inches, plus 12 inches to equal 19. This allows for the extra easing that might be needed. So cut 4 border strips, 3.5 inches wide by 19 for each block. To position the border strip, mark a dot 1/4 inch inside each corner of the block. Then center a strip on one side of the block. Begin sewing, not at the end, but at the 1/4 inch dot, and sew to the 1/4 inch dot on the other corner. Be sure to backstitch at each dot and let the end of the strips extend and hang free. Sew all border strips exactly the same way. Once the borders are attached, press the seams in one direction, either all in or all outward. Trim the ends of the strips, using the adjacent border's raw edge as a guide. This forms an overlapping right angle at the corner. To form the miter, align the strips with the right sides together and the corners square. With your ruler, draw a straight diagonal line from the 1/4 inch mark to the outside corner of the border. Sew along that same diagonal line from the inside corner mark to the outside, backstitching at the beginning. Trim excess fabric, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then press the seams in the same direction at the corners. It will make a nice staggered connection later when the entire quilt is assembled. Each of the blocks for the True Blue quilt were individually quilted after the mitered borders were added. The blocks were then joined together to form horizontal rows, and then the rows were joined together just like I did the carnival quilt. Once the entire quilt was assembled, I used muslin bias binding to finish the edges. Then, looking at the garden party wall hanging, we can see that the basic block is smaller than the original Going My Way block. It is only an 8-inch square instead of the 12-inch square I used for the Carnival and True Blue quilts. Notice also how I've turned the corner squares and left the center as a square. So if you want to make this block, you'll need to use the templates A8, B8, and C8. But what really makes the Garden Party distinctive from the other 2 quilts is that the 20 blocks are set together with sashing strips. In the corner of the strips are tiny 9-patch square inserts. With the old-fashioned method of piecing, we would trace a template 9 times for each of the 30 9-patch squares. But we can use the quickie piecing technique to speed up the process. For this technique, cut 1.5-inch wide strips of solids and prints. Sew the strips together to form multicolored bands. Now use the same fabrics and sew 2 more bands together, but reverse the order in which they are sewn together. Once the bands are sewn together, cut them apart every 1.5 inch. Make certain that you press these bands so that they alternate when the rectangles are sewn together. Then sew these 3.5 by 1.5 inch strips together to make the 9-patch blocks. Make sure all the blocks are an exact 3.5 inch square. Then cut 49 3.5 by 8.5 inch rectangles for the sashing. Sew 24 of these rectangles to the 9-patch squares to create 6 horizontal sashing rows. Sew the remaining rectangles onto the 8.5 inch square blocks. And then sew the sashing rows to the blocks. Here's a sample section of the garden party quilt. Since this top was so much smaller than the Carnival or True Blue quilts, I waited until I had assembled the entire top before I quilted it in a supported hoop. I finished the edges of the garden party quilt with a multicolored prairie point border. These points are made by folding a 2 3/4 inch square in half and pressing the folded corner to the center of the raw edge. Then align and baste the individual points along the edge, the outer edge of your finished quilt. Baste these in place, but I'm going to just pin them for an example to show you. Alternate your colors and decide how you want them positioned. Pin them in place and sew them on the machine. And then those would come back, revealing the little prairie point border, and the backing of the quilt would then be simply slip stitched in place. Lap quilting, whether it's done 1 block at a time or 1 section at a time, has made it easier for us to complete a quilt that many of us thought was just too cumbersome to even begin. Our completed quilts will keep us warm in style. Thank you so much for inviting me into your home. Now when I go, delight in what you have accomplished and prepare for the applause.